A conceptual model, often used to teach children about evolution, particularly how speciation occurs, is what I'll call the flood and lake model. It goes like this. At the beginning, there's a large lake in a river basin with many fish of the same species. Then comes a drought, which causes the lake to gradually dry up, leaving some parts of the formerly expansive lake completely dry. As the drought continues, many smaller lakes are left behind. A species of fish that swam freely across the large lake is now separated into these smaller lakes, each with different conditions. The drought eases up a little and the climate stabilizes. Over time, these fish experience genetic drift and evolve adaptations that help them survive in their respective lakes. The result of this process is many new species of fish and many new lakes from what used to be a single species and a single lake. We can play this scenario in reverse to understand how a more homogeneous ecosystem might arise. Perhaps many isolated lakes in the river basin are flooded, drastically changing the environment and putting formerly separated species of fish in competition with one another. There might be enough similarity between some species that hybridization occurs. Regardless, what used to be many distinct ecosystems is now one ecosystem with its own set of niches. Some species of fish adapt more quickly and come to dominate the new lake, while other species of fish perish entirely. Modernity is like a flood, but the thing about floods or droughts is that they are both anomalous. What makes them noteworthy is their infrequency and the disruptive effects they have on a balanced ecosystem. There are some who might see the power of a flood and be convinced that it will only intensify. There is a common temptation when forecasting to take very recent trends and extend them linearly into the future. What is more likely? That a flood permanently occupies the river basin and the waters never subside, or that the water in the basin eventually drains, reverting the landscape back to a collection of smaller, less connected lakes? It is possible that a new reservoir decidedly takes the place of a multitude of lakes. Perhaps modernity is more like a dam. In any case, I find it strange that most people are more prepared to accept and adapt to the finality of a reservoir than the temporary condition of a flood. Given that I can't predict the future or be certain about the nature of the waters in which we now swim, I will entertain both possibilities, so perhaps I might swim a little better. Whether the floodwaters recede or continue to rise, we recognize that the flood has forever changed our basin. The flood of modernity started in the lakes of Europe, then overflowed into just about every other lake. Some lakes remain awfully stubborn. During a hard rain, they might be temporarily joined with the floodwaters, only to be separated once more when the sun comes out. The flood has been fed by a mostly steadfast rain, though not without irregularities. When the waters are high, fish from the flood enter those smaller lakes, competing with the local fish for resources. Similarly, some of the fish in the smaller lakes make their way out into the vastness of the flood. A fraction of the fish thrive in their new waters, another fraction dies. Some simply cannot adapt to their new environment and go hungry. Some eat smaller fish they find, and some are eaten by larger fish that find them. Some fish stubbornly choose to swim near the sites of their former lakes, despite being entirely subsumed by the flood. These spaces are accessible by any fish within the floodwaters, and they watch as fish, both large and small, make their former lakes their new swimming ground. Some of the newcomers stay, others swim off. There is much water to swim through, after all. In this new environment that's been imposed upon fish from many lakes, some have found it advantageous to adapt, to change their behavior, and go against the old instincts that served them well in their former lakes. While some of this adaptation is the result of choice, much of it occurs naturally. One old instinct is to stay close to home, the ecosystem you're adapted for. Becoming free from the preference of the familiar, you now gain access to the greater waters of the flood and all that is within them. A rolling stone gathers no moss, but a swimming fish can breathe easier. If I was able to break free from those old instincts, I might be more inclined to believe in the permanence of the mighty flood, that its waters will surely consume the remaining lakes holed out on the edges, and that there will be nothing left in the basin apart from the floodwaters. We all must justify the decisions we make, to ourselves if to no one else. The way we live out our lives is no small issue. What about the fish that refuse to adapt in the flood or merge into a new species? Can't they see how unsuitable their behaviors are for this new environment? They're keeping the whole ecosystem back from achieving a new equilibrium. In the West, we've been swimming in these floodwaters for a long time, which might explain why so many can't see the logic of clinging to the old ways, to the ways of our ancestors. Those who prefer the old ways certainly can't seem to live up to those aspirations. Truthfully, there is no logic. Hardly any thought process underlies one's preference to live closer to the ideals of the past than the present. Reason is often conjured up after an action occurs. On most issues, you can't really convince somebody using facts and logic. Our behavior in the flood of modernity is better explained by intrinsic values. Those of us who stick to our stubborn old ways and resist adapting to the niches of this new ecosystem feel deprived, hungry. We weren't designed for this, but even the fish who have adapted feel malnourished. Despite their best efforts, they too fall short of the demands of this environment. None of us are meant for these waters. We can double down on adaptation or we can resist. In either case, we all remain ill-fitted, foreigners regardless of the lakes we came from. In the great waters of the flood, with all its room and resources, most of us actually grow to a smaller size than we would have in our old lakes. There is a mismatch here. The environment changed much faster than we could. In a real ecosystem, such an abrupt change could very well lead to a mass die-off of all the fish in the river basin. Fish living in the few lakes on the edges of the flood could survive. Perhaps the flood carried some fish away into a more hospitable basin. Maybe those fish who double their efforts to adapt in the flood will thrive, properly transforming into a new species fit for the new environment. The conclusion really depends on the nature of the flood and the lay of the land. Assuming the flood never subsides and the waters remain high, what might a fish with an aversion to change do to survive? This fish shouldn't be afraid to venture beyond familiar territory, because in a way, all territory is now unfamiliar. It's increasingly all we know. Even in the flooded river basin, there are still nooks and crannies, places on the lake floor that more closely resemble where we came from. There are still those small lakes and puddles on the edges of the flood you could find your way into. With a new ecosystem comes new niches, new roles to be filled. Some might require less adaptation on the part of a stubborn fish than others. The obvious niches are often already filled, as evidenced by how many fish are in competition for them. Think outside the niche. You might find refuge in a place you least expect, a place seldom paid much attention to. In the event that some kind of calamity falls upon the flooded basin, some kind of disease, for example, you will be further removed from the effects than those fish who adapted to a larger niche. The key fallacy in assuming the longevity of the flood is that, unlike a flood, what we live in is no act of God. Fish don't play a role in whether their lake gets flooded or not, but we do. Our day-to-day decisions actually affects how high the floodwaters rise, even if that effect is very small. A reservoir created by a dam is the work of human hands, and even our greatest works in this material world crumbled to dust with time. Maybe our dam is very well built this time, but history has many examples of dam failures. If we live to witness the floodwaters subside and lakes of old reappear, those who place themselves in the locations of the old lakes will end up in new lakes. They will be better prepared for this new environment than fish who arrive in haste or by chance. Many of the fish who adapted to the environment of the flood will be unable to survive the disappearance of their ecosystem. Depending on how quickly the flood dries up or drains out, they might be unable to adapt fast enough to the environment of the new lakes. Some will revert back more easily to their instinctual ways of living, but only a fraction will be in lakes that they can thrive in. Places that were once less desirable in the flood will become fledgling ecosystems. Fish who seek out these places early may have much to look forward to. They should choose a destination by balancing their instincts and traditional ways of living with present and future conditions. In the flood of modernity, it can be difficult to foresee what might come to pass, to find a place of belonging, or a proper role to play. I would trust in the deep rhythm, in those big cycles that leave their marks in layers of rock. We should plan not just for ourselves, but for our progeny. The lakes they are born into might not resemble the lakes of old exactly, but they will find themselves in a proper home because we were discerning in the flood.